and this is what I think about all day and night. I hope I've given you something to think about as well. And Fritz, I'm ready for some questions if you have them. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. I didn't know we learned so much about turkey insemination and horse manure, but I'm thinking about forming like a horse manure OPEC, since the value seems to have gone up. But we have a lot of questions, which we will get to here. Maybe we should call this part of this talk "Monkey with a Dartboard." Does that work for you?
Fine.
All right.
Works with me.
Okay. So the first question is, Stephen, why is everyone sitting in front of a library for these kind of video meetings? Did you read all the volumes behind you? And does it say anything about me that my slate is blank?
So I know it is true that people have been curating their Zoom views pretty aggressively, and I've seen that. All I can say is that I'm sitting at my desk where I normally sit, and that is what's behind me. If you want, I can show you. If I'd faced this way, there would be more books there. And if I'd faced this way, there would be, I don't know if you're catching them, more books over there. But the reason I chose this was because not only does it have, books, but it's also got my pet there. I don't know if you can see the kitty cat. So now this is an unusual cat. It's virtually an indestructible cat. You could just see that you can do anything to this kitty cat. This is actually a stunt cat. We did an episode of Freakonomics Radio years ago called, I think it was called The Cremation of Stevie the Cat, where we wanted to know if when you send your pet for cremation, for a private cremation, whether it's actually a private one or whether it's mixed in with potentially other pets or even roadkill, which is much more common. And it turns out there's some chicanery going on in the pet cremation business. So in terms of the books behind me, I actually do have some encyclopedias up there. I bought a virgin set of the very last edition of the Encyclopedia it's Britannica, I think, yeah. I hated the idea that the Britannica was no longer going to be printed, because as a kid I grew up reading World Book, and I really read that thing and I loved it. So I did buy that set, which honestly I don't use very much, but I love having it there. And then these are just my workbooks over there. That's the nonfiction. Then over there is fiction and other stuff. And then if I could walk into another room, there'd be many more books than these. So I actually have books. It's kind of what I have. Sorry for that unsatisfying answer.
No. And the Journal of Economic Agriculture sitting around somewhere. And I just want to remind viewers that no animals were harmed in the making of this event.
Well, I don't know if you can say that, because just so you know, this fake cat, which is apparently just purchased by people for companionship, but people who want a little companionship but not too much, it actually is real rabbit fur. And so I can't vouch that the rabbits weren't killed violently. I don't know. I hope not, but I know when I hurt this cat, it's not hurting a real animal, but the bunnies may have been hurt. I just don't know.
We don't know. Gotcha. All right. Next question. This person says, I work for a nonprofit. One of the many unfortunate results of the pandemic is that the demand for our services increases at a time when the resources available to us are more difficult to come by. How can the philanthropic community and society in general best address this? It seems like supply and demand models don't work here.
You're right. They just don't. I mean, the best news I can say is that what we're seeing right now is what you'd call a demand shock and a supply shock. that are not what they call secular movements. In other words, I mean, this is one of the most hopeful things about the economy generally right now. The underlying economy was very, very, very good here. As it begins to return, it's certainly not going to be that good, but in some ways it may be even better. And it will be worse in other ways too. But what this is, it's a reallocation of labor, a reallocation of capital, and so on. So I think we all understand how that happens. One of the first episodes of Freakonomics Radio we did during the pandemic, and I like this one a lot because we learned a great deal, was about the food supply chain. And we did talk to someone from a big food bank in the Midwest, and they were making the point that they were getting hit from all sides. Their main suppliers are personal philanthropy, restaurants, and supermarket chains. Restaurants all closed, so the food bank got, in the short run, a big donation from the restaurants who couldn't use their stock, but then that was over. Grocery stores have very little surplus. They're getting nothing from them, and they're getting very little cash donation because all of a sudden people are worried about their livelihoods. All of those facets are already somewhat on the way to correction, but it's still going to be really hard. Look, you can't fix the underlying, if you're running your nonprofit, you can't fix the outbound, the exterior supply and demand per se. What you can do is get more efficient about how you raise money. So what I would suggest is you look up, there's an economist at the University of Chicago named John List, L-I-S-T. There's another John List on Wikipedia who's a serial killer. That's not the one you want. But there's an economist at the University of Chicago named John List who is really the world's foremost expert in many things, in experimental economics. And he's done a lot of work to understand how fundraisers can be much more effective, how to bundle matching funds with an ask, how to use lotteries and other incentives. And so if you read some of his work, hopefully you can find some good tips, because honestly, all you can do right now, I think, is try to increase your supply of cash.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of economy-related questions. I'm going to ask two of these because I think you're going to want to maybe wrap some points up around these. But the first one is, it's clear we're devoid of enough information on the impact of the pandemic. What new data sets do you think we need to start collecting to really understand the pandemic's impact? And then the second part is, from an economic standpoint, how do we measure the point at which it makes sense to reopen the economy? Cost of human lives versus contraction of the economy. It seems like in order to do so, we need to somehow place a value on a human life in order to come up with a break-even analysis.
Yeah, these are great questions, really hard questions. Again, these are exactly the kind of things we've been trying to do in our recent episodes of Freakonomics Radio. So I don't mean to make this sound promotional, but if you want to hear a lot more than I have time to say here in just 2 minutes remaining, you might want to check out those episodes. We did an episode called How Do You Reopen a Country? It's really, really hard. I will say this, look, economists invented the idea of putting a dollar value on a human life. After a tragedy like 9/11, there are values put on survivors and so on. So that is doable. But I think the bigger question is, how do you balance, like you implied, returning the economy with risk? Life is full of risk all the time. The single riskiest thing that you and I do every day is get in a car. That's the most likely way that we are going to die other than natural causes. But we do it all the time because we like mobility. In terms of the information we need a lot more testing. And we need coordinated testing. But even if we had all the testing capability, the incentives for testing are not very good right now. If you think about it, most people wouldn't want a positive result because that would knock them out of circulation. So one solution that we discussed on a show recently was to create an incentive so that everybody who gets a test would get, let's say, and would be entered in a lottery for $1 billion. Maybe it could be a state lottery. That would increase the incentive for people to get tested. But then what happens if you're positive? Well, then you need to make the benefit for staying home very strong, because you don't want people to say, well, it's what economists call, again, a negative externality. If I'm communicable, but I'm not that sick, it's not much of a problem for me to go out, but it's a big problem for you, and it's a big problem for your father or grandmother. And so you want the incentives to be lined up. And right now, we're working all those out. Look, I know it's very easy to complain about how mishmash, disorganized, controversial a lot of the response has been in this country particularly, but elsewhere. This is a hard problem. We've never dealt with anything at all of this type or magnitude. I think the number of smart and well-intentioned people grotesquely outweighs the number of idiots and evil people. So I take a lot of comfort in knowing that even without strong financial incentives for pharmaceutical companies, there's so much science happening right now, and it's happening much faster than it's ever happened before. Don't forget, we're used to the speed of digital technology, but biological technology doesn't move that much faster than it used to. Digital technology helps, but the speed of science is still pretty slow. All of a sudden, we've accelerated that as well. So I think, a little bit of patience, a little bit of good cheer, and a little bit of, honestly, smart thinking and giving other people the benefit of the doubt that they too will engage in smart thinking is maybe my one prediction for how we can minimize the downsides going forward and hopefully come out of this fairly well, fairly soon, with potentially even, some upsides.
I think we have time for one last question here before we let you get back to studying turkey insemination. This is on healthcare. We had a few questions on that. What is your perspective? This is the way that the question was worded. What's your perspective on the freakonomics of healthcare, given $4 trillion will be spent on healthcare in the U.S. this year and the impact of COVID-19 on increasing costs for the caring of patients? What can or should be done to bend the cost curve?
I love the questions from this crowd because they all pertain to things that we've recently worked on or are currently working on. We have a really interesting episode that was ready to come out right around when COVID hit, and it's exactly about healthcare costs. So look, this is a big topic, obviously, and I can't do it justice in a minute or two. What I will say is this: look at the incentives and look at why they're perverse. Once you understand how the incentives align, you understand why the medical community does what it does, which is offer a lot of services and not a lot of prevention. You understand why patients do what they do, which is the worried well often overconsume, whereas the unwell often don't have good access. You understand how institutions behave, how hospitals, even though they're nonprofits, often try to optimize for maximum revenues, which is why you saw there isn't a whole lot of ICU capacity when you have something like a pandemic. And then you look at insurance. I'll leave you with just one thing to think about. This is something that when I first heard about this, I was kind of gobsmacked that this is why things are the way they are. But I never knew. Maybe you all know this, but I never knew. If you think about it, one way that the U.S. is different than any other rich country in the world, one you could say is we don't have government-provided healthcare. That's mostly true, although we do have some government-provided healthcare and other places have some private insurance. But the big way that we're all different is private healthcare in this country is connected to employment. So we all take that for granted. Like literally, if you have a job, like a regular full-time job, an employer, they provide your healthcare insurance. Think about that for a second. Does that make sense? Well, maybe, but like they don't provide my car insurance or my home insurance or life insurance. They don't send my kids to school. Why are they providing my health insurance? The reason really goes back to World War II. And after World War II, there were wage controls enacted to keep wages down because the economy was growing so fast. There were worries about inflation and so on. So you couldn't give an employee more money. It was capped. So what the federal government did was they enabled you to give employees a benefit, a fringe benefit, healthcare coverage. And the government enabled the employer to write off the cost of that healthcare coverage on their taxes. That's what created a large part of the problem that we've got now, where you've got a lot of people paying for things and being paid for things where it's so complex and indirect, and where the incentives are so misaligned that you get a lot of silly behavior, including the fact that sometimes people will take a particular job or will not leave a particular job because of their healthcare insurance. It's very common, but think for just a second about how twisted that is. Like, you literally don't get to do what you want to do in life or where you want to do it because you're worried about not having your healthcare insurance, which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So this is what I mean by, this is why I do what I do. You try to find the data to understand the layers below, the incentives that have created this situation, and then, only then, can you start to peel it back and hopefully improve it. Because if you're making your arguments based on just ideology or dogma or emotion or politics, then you're not making a real argument. Then you're just shouting. If you can understand how things are the way they are, how they could perhaps be improved by realigning the incentives, then you're actually contributing or trying to. So that's the idea.
Great, thank you. Well, I would like to extend my thank you to the audience for their great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Would like to invite all of you to come again at the same time next week. We have Jack McCullough. He is the founder of the CFO Leadership Council, and he's going to be talking about the secrets of CFO rock stars. But Stephen, thank you so much for your time today, for entertaining us, for making us think, and keep up the great work, and we'll keep listening to your great podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really great to be with you all virtually, which, as you know, is my favorite way. I'm sure you're perfectly nice people, but I enjoyed this a lot. Thank you very much.